you make better prototypes. I'm not talking about the kind of graphic design skill that you need to create a finished product. I'm just talking about making prototypes that are easier to play, because the point of your prototype is not to test the graphics. I mean, it is to test the graphics, but the point is not to test the patience of your play testers. It's to get the point of your game across. And every element of your game, including the graphics, needs to be tested as long as you can, for as deeply into the project as you can. If you have a layout that's working, that's great. So we're going to talk about some of that. My name's James Ernest. I'm a game inventor. This is just a slice of my resume. These are all the, or some of the titles I did at Cheap Ass Games. And I also did most of the graphic design for these games. Again, not drawing the pictures necessarily, but arranging the information on the page, choosing how it's supposed to look in the final, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Getting from your idea to your first prototype is the stage that we're talking about here, first, second, third prototype. We're not talking about getting it to a finished product. So these are the very first prototype cards from the Xenophile trading card game, which was the precursor to the Girl Genius trading, not trading card game, just Girl Genius card game that I've got down here. But you can see there's a lot of similarities even between these first cards. Symbols around the edges that have colors, a name, some details, a point value. That's just a tracking number. Actually, that is the number that tells me what color all goes around the edges. What it does. All of those aspects we're testing from the very start, and they do show up in the final layout. Some things move around, some things stay the same. But this is a lot of information in very specific places in a very specific way that needed to be laid out pretty early. This is where we're going to go. Let's talk about type first. You probably own about 1,000 fonts. You can access about 10,000 fonts. You probably need about 3 of them. You're not really trying to do something final or pretty. You're trying to do something functional. So there's 3 things you're going to want to get some control over. The first one is a headline font, a title font, a font that is easy to read for things like names. There's a body text font that you want to find, that you fall in love with something that's really easy to read at small point sizes. And then if sometimes you need a font that has specifically very legible numbers, because the numbers are the parts of your prototypes that need to be read the most often from the greatest distance and in the weirdest circumstances. So let's talk about those 3 things. Specifically, here are some examples of good headline fonts. They're fairly simple, they're easy to read, they're accessible. I have Papyrus here, just kidding, because I'm just kidding. When you're a graphic designer, you sort of spot Papyrus and Comic Sans in the wild everywhere, and you just start screaming like, "Ah, not again!" Because they're accessible, because they ship with Microsoft Word, and they're the only 2 interesting-looking fonts in that space, but they're kind of bad. Anyway, the rest of these are fine. I put Nutmeg in there. That's the one I just used for Girl Genius, and I like a lot about that typeface. But every one of these is just easy to read, and that's why they're on this list. Even more boring and even more easy to read are these body type fonts. They all kind of look the same, really, and the only difference is whether they're serif or sans serif. You'll see different schools of thought about which of these is easier to read at a small point size. There's not really an agreement on that, but whatever it is, that's the purpose of this font. It's to be very legible and very familiar at a very small point size. If you have to read a lot of type, it needs to be as clear as possible. Here's some fonts I've used for numerals. Numbers have a very special challenge. Like I said, sometimes they have to get read in play upside down at a distance. And so every one of these has good hints in it, even when they're upside down, about what each one of the numbers is. And I've actually got a more detailed example than this we're going to go through here. This example sort of points up one of the differences between the artist's job and the graphic designer's job. The artist did great art for this game, absolutely fantastic, but he also picked a typeface for the corner that was illegible. He may have drawn this himself, I'm not sure where it comes from, but it's very stylized, but it doesn't do the work of being legible. And if you look at these numbers upside down, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. A lot of them turn into what look like right side up letter forms. So it's really hard to tell an upside down 4 from an H until you have played the game a lot and can really identify these specific shapes. Even when you can, all the line weights are the same. There's no indication that something's upside down. So this is a really hard typeface to read for the numbers. That's what they look like in play. Try to figure out which card is missing. It takes a while. You really have to figure out what each one of those is before you can eliminate them. And that's a challenge for a game that's going to get actually, played and shuffled around. So I went and got something that was sort of similar. It's a pseudo-period typeface called Mouse Memoirs. And this one is actually a typeface. It's not just a bunch of lines. And it has subtle indications throughout of serifs and which are upside down and which are right side up. The 6 and the 9 are still exactly the same. That's like 99% of fonts just do that. And on these particular cards, we use a Las Vegas trick. We write SIX on the 6s, so they're easy to tell from the 9s. That's what those look like upside down. They're a little bit more legible. And that's a real example of cards in play. Again, you can kind of shoot through this. It's the same cards, so you won't have any trouble figuring out what's missing, but they're easier to read. There they are next to each other. Choosing type like this instead of type like this, at the stage I'm talking about, is just going to make your prototypes harder to play. And that's the last thing you want. We're not really talking, again, about getting this out the door to the finished, although these are the types that I use for the finished product. It was more important to me to be able to test this, and whenever I make a new pairs deck, I make sure to print the final deck with the numbers on it and play the game with those cards to leave nothing to chance. There's some actual examples of typefaces that I've used and how they wound up in the final product. I'm always putting them in a frame that tells you which way is right side up, and these are all in the corners of cards. These are all taken out of pairs cards except that one. And pairs is just a deck of numbers. That's all that's on the cards. It's just the numbers 1 through 10. So it's pretty important that they be legible. This section is about how type tells a story. We're going to pick a game that I know is not a game. It's just a name to Andrew. So if you are Andrew, then this game's you. Anybody? Yes? No? The type that you choose for the logo is going to communicate what the game is about. So if I picked a typeface like this, what would you think this game was about?
Horror.
Might be a horror game, right? Might be a Victorian murder mystery ghost game, that sort of thing, right? How about this one?
Is it a game or are you going to tea?
That's right. Is it a game or are we going to tea? That's right. This is a game that thinks it's a jewelry store. I don't know what board game this is, but it certainly has a look. How about that guy?
Old West.
Maybe Old West. Maybe fantasy, although I call this one steampunk because it's like Victorian but didn't take the trouble to actually do any hand-drawn letter forms. It just picked a font and spelled the name out. How about that guy?
You're in a coffee shop.
Looks expensive.
What's that?
Like the cheap end of the spectrum.
Oh yeah, I think this looks cheap. That's possible. These typefaces to me suggest something noir, so something in a Maltese Falcon kind of a place. But yeah, maybe it just looks cheap. I don't know. You think it's the black and whiteness? We're not doing color yet. That's another stage. How about that guy? Resource management, right? This one looks like every German game, right? Yeah, this one to me looks more like a D&D or a game about burning down monasteries or something like that. But we really haven't done anything to these. We haven't added a lot of graphics to these. We've just chosen type and communicated information through that. The trouble is if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to communicate the wrong information, and you want to give expectations to players about what they're supposed to be doing. So be very smart and also be sort of sparing about how you use this weapon. There's a style of design that is difficult on purpose, popular through the 90s and still usable in some places today. You use this type of technique to make people slow down. You get people's attentions in album covers and posters when you want people to really, really take their time reading each word. Don't do this by mistake. Don't pick a font that looks kind of cool but is really hard to read for all of your text, because that's difficult by mistake. Let's talk about layout. This is actually kind of the heart of the presentation in this. Graphic design is mostly about arranging information in a space in a way that it's easy for people to see. This is UI design, and this is also graphic design for board games. We're going to talk about this ugly-ass card that I have made as wrong as I can and go through some of the places that I could have done a little better. What do you notice about this before I go through the elements? Well, okay, that's interesting. The one thing that isn't wrong with this is the fact that there's negative space. Negative space actually draws your eyes in the right direction. This one isn't used very well. Whoops. This negative space isn't used very well. It's over here, and it's just kind of hanging out. But actually, a card that's just chock full of words is really hard to read. So if you use the negative space correctly, you can draw the eye in the right direction. So let's talk about what actually is here. First of all, I put the flavor text up at the top, which is kind of dumb. That's not the most important thing about the card. I also sort of froze it to the edge. Freezing is a term you'll see in comic books, but basically when you have someone's elbow just touching the edge of a panel, it's much more annoying than if it overlaps or comes in a little bit. So that's just annoying along with everything else because it's up against the edge. And practically speaking, because this card is going to be cut by a machine, sometimes those things are going to get cut off. The art is kind of the negative space of the card in some ways. Everyone knows that it's just a picture. If you hide game information in the art, you're very, very mean. So that's where that's sitting. And again, it's not the most important thing about the card, so it probably shouldn't be at the top. That's the title of the card. It's little and it's an ugly font. But another thing about it is that it doesn't really line up with anything. Nothing on this card really belongs on the same place. You should, and you'll see later when I rearrange this thing, have lines that draw the eye in the right way. This just said it was slapped on there by mistake, and it's so easy not to do that. Don't do that. There's the effect text. It's in the ugliest font I could find. Again, that's sort of a straw man, but it's only there to illustrate that even when it's slightly unreadable, it's a terrible mistake. There's the company logo. Nobody needs that. I mean, somebody did pay $5 for this. It's an okay logo, but it doesn't belong on every card. Anything that is on every card doesn't belong on any of them, probably, except labels and stuff. And here's the real problem. What the hell are these things, and what are they doing down here? It's 3 different numbers about this card that are all on kind of the same color of icon and in sort of the same place and doing nothing. They're too small and they're not very well labeled. So let's rearrange this thing. There's the empty space. What I'm going to tell you about this card actually kind of lives in play. It's not a card you would hold in your hand. It's like, and that's why it's a card or a board element or a game board or whatever. But if you are holding it in your hand, the information on the card is going to tell a story in the same direction that you read, from upper left to lower right. So things that are up here are basically first, and things that are down there are basically last. If you can arrange your information in a way that corresponds to when you need it, you're helping your player figure out how it works. Remember, players are going to play this for the first time and try to look at this thing and sort it out without reading the rules. How much help can you give them before they finally break down and actually crack the rule book? So the first thing I'm going to do is move this thing, that whatever that is. It's on a coin, so I'm going to assume it's the price. And I'm going to mark it price, because that is actually something that does belong on every card. Help me remember what that thing is. Don't be afraid to write it on there. I did keep the coin icon, but I made it a little bit bigger, easier to read up in the top corner, because the price seems like the first thing you would do with this card. You would buy it. I don't know. That's not a real game, but that's an assumption. And I'm already starting to establish these invisible lines that align everything on the card and make it look like it belongs together. There's the title, nice and bold at the top. It says I am a title. It's in a font that's easy to read. My graphic designer down the road can pick a better type for that is actually from Star Wars or whatever. I just want to be able to read it, and I want people to know that that's what it is and move past it. What the hell was this? Well, it's probably health. And I'm going to use a video game trope here, and I'm going to put the health in this space, and I'm actually going to count it out because I think it's that important. Part of what I'm doing with this space is negative space right here that implies that I could have as much as 7 health. That there's some cards that are this strong, and I'm going to use this space in the same way on every card, so that this 3 here is not just a 3, but it's actually a fragment of 7. That's how much. That's what a healthy thing looks like. So that's why I used that space the way I did.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How about having outlines of the hearts of how, so that people would know how far up the house potentially could
That's
go?
possible. I don't need to imply that much information, and I think that it would tell you the wrong thing about this card to say that this card could charge up to 7 health, which isn't my point. What I'm trying to imply with this is that there's other cards in the deck that are stronger, but not that this could get more healthy.
Well, I meant in the context that way you remember you haven't read the game book. You know,
Right.
You know it reads. So.
Yeah, that's a possibility, and I would say any idea that you have like that, try it and see which one works better. All of this needs to be tested. right? This is getting built for a prototype with the express purpose of putting it in front of people watching and see if they get it, and if they don't, rearrange it again. There's the art, there's the effect text, there's the flavor text, and the last thing down here, this other number that was on a diamond ring is now in a little gem, and it's labeled 2. Whatever that is, it's the point value of the card, or it's the thing you get when you destroy it or when you sell it or whatever. It's the last thing you need to know about this card, so I put it down in that corner. This whole example actually comes from a real game that I played this spring, where someone handed me a card that just didn't make any sense, and my testers and I just started rearranging the information in a way that read in the right order. And there's all those invisible lines that make everything sort of belong in the same place. I took the game logo, the company logo off, and I put this here. That might be an art credit. On a playtest game, that's probably a version number or something else. I have some games in development right now where I've just given each card a serial number so that when I change things about it, I know which thing in the spreadsheet I'm changing. But that's a good spot for that information. And it clearly says to the player, I don't care. Turning it sideways, making it a small font. Everything about that placement says you don't need to know this. And that's pretty important when you're playing a game for the first time, to be able to parse out the things that don't matter, like the art, and the things that do matter, like what the heck this card does. Now, I don't know what this does. I don't know what that effect is, and I don't want to know what ruthlessness is and drink containers and all that, but that is the same information that was on the first card. This is enough to play test with, obviously, maybe even too much, some people would say. Every stage of your play test is going to be testing a different thing and asking a different question, but sometime in the middle of development, your cards can look like this, and you're testing the layout itself. And that can inform whatever the final design is. Your designer can say, well, was this working? Yes, good, I'm going to use that, right? You can go into final production and say, this layout was working for us, here's why, here's what we tried that didn't work. For God's sake, don't take us back to that. Talk about some real examples here, practical utility of cards. In this case, cards that are in full view. So this would also apply to game boards or anything else that's always in full view. These are cards from video poker. Look how different they look from actual playing cards. Because these cards are never held in a hand, they're never fanned, they're never showed upside down. They're missing a lot of the visual cues that are on a regular playing card. They only have one pip and not a bunch of pips in the center, because the numeral is all you really need to distinguish. The suit is more important, so they put the suit big, they have one numeral on them. Something else strange, they have this blazon on the ace. All the face cards and the ace have artwork in this space, and all the number cards don't. And the reason is because in video poker, an ace is a high card, and it's in the bracket of high cards that are different from cards that are 10 and below. So that little extra piece of art on the ace tells you that it belongs in a category different from the number cards next to it. Here's a card which spends its life in play. The most important thing is that big letter A. Everyone needs to see that. And when this card is in play, there's often money stacked on this part of it. The A is above the money because other people need to see it, and the money blocks their line of sight if it was below it. So from my perspective, I can see over my stack of chips and see that letter A. Everyone else gets to see the A first, and they don't have to look over the stack of chips. The 10 and the 4 are less important. Those are only important when I buy the card, but the A is important all the way through its life in play. And then everything below, the art, the flavor text, the name of the card, that's all incidental. Doesn't really matter to the gameplay. That's why it's down there. There's Mos Eisley. This is another one. These dice and that number are the only thing that matter about this card. The flavor text is fun but irrelevant to the mechanics. And sometimes these dice are covered up with actual dice, but those dice are going to look the same as the pictures on the card. Sometimes you hold cards in your hand, and in this case, this real estate here is the most important part of the card. The index, the upper left corner of the card, should tell you everything you can possibly know about this card without being too dense to read. So in this case, when I fan these cards, I can see the beginnings of the title, I can see what kind of card it is, that border color tells me something, that's the cost of the card, that's an effect of playing it. All of that is up here, and the only thing that's really in the middle is the effect text, which is way too much to put up in the corner. The name of the card, though, if I know the game a little bit, reminds me what the effect text is. And I can see a glimpse of that in the corner. Same thing here. The F, W, and M distinguish the three different kinds of cards in this game, so that's all I really need to see there. I can see the beginning for instance, the Tennessee room, I can see just the beginning of it, how many points it's worth, how many luck it's worth. The rest of this down here is actually redundant. It's already spelled out up here. But if I don't know what this card does, then I can read that text and see what it does. Some cards have to do both. They spend some time on the table. They spend some time in your hand. So they do need to be indexed, but not necessarily so much. These are cards from Witch Trial that spend a lot of their time in an auction line, and then some time in your hand, and then some time on a trial board. Some of them get played straight out of your hand. Some of them spend some time in play. Same thing here with the spy game cards. And again, I've basically just got the card type denoted by the color of the background, and then a number or a letter in the corner. That's all there really is to those cards. I also double index these cards in case you don't want to turn them upside down in your hand, because there's little enough information in these cards that you don't really need to turn your hand upside down or sort them. It's just easier to put an index in both corners. These cards get jumbled in play. They're played in real-time games. The games are very fast. And so along with having very little information on the card, I also make sure that even the slightest glimpse of the border of each card tells you what it is. The whole background of this card is purple, the same purple. So when a little corner is peeking out, I know what I'm looking at. Same thing here. Most of these cards, you can identify them just from the edge. There's a black area here on the block cards and a blue area here on the hits, so you know that they're similar, but they're different. They're the same color, but they work differently. And the one of these cards that doesn't really work like that is the clear card, because that's the one card that doesn't spend any time in play. You play it and you throw it away immediately. And some cards you play lots of games with. And when you have that situation, you need to make sure that they work in all of the different ways we've talked about above. They work when they're in play, they work when they're in your hand, they even work when they're jumbled up like this. So that's why playing cards have the design that they have, because they've evolved through all the games you can play with playing cards. They used to look like this. Look at that mess. To figure out which card is which, you really have to look at the whole card here, and sometimes you have to count the pips. This is a secondary refinement on that. These are a little easier to shuffle. They have square corners now. They're easy to mass produce, but they still don't have an index in the corner. I couldn't find the cards I wanted to find, but the very sort of first proto-indexing of cards like this had an entire snapshot of the card in the corner. It didn't have a numeral and a suit. It had the entire card, because that's what people were used to looking at. They shrunk it and they also stuck it up in the corner. And then here's what they look like today. And these are actually quad index, because they're European playing cards. And in Europe, people tend to fan their cards to the left or to the right. Let's talk a little bit about color. You probably know this, but colors mean things. There's already sort of a shorthand for health and poison and mountains. I mean, we already sort of know this language. And it's like English. You don't really need to invent a new language or teach someone a new language to play your game. Learn the language of color as well. And then, like when we used red for the health instead of gold in that Mos Eisley card, it was because that's a color everybody knows. It goes with the heart shape, but it also is just a color that people know for that use. You can't really see in this picture, but this is a muted color palette. There's no pure white, there's no pure black. It's a family of colors that works together and tells a story about where this particular deck came from. It's supposed to be an old deck of cards. It's supposed to be a deck your grandmother might have played with. And so there's a paper texture, and it's all lost on the screen here, but it's a family of colors that works together and tells that story. But also each one of these cards does have to have a distinct color, because this is one of those games where a jumble of cards in play sometimes needs to get read as such. You can look at a corner of one of these cards because they each have a distinct border color and know what card it is. Some people can't see color. So this is Photoshop's preview of what a red-green colorblind person would see in these cards. This is a strictly grayscale version of these cards. And again, on this screen you can't tell very well, but we used a background texture as well as a color to distinguish these. There's water droplets in the blue, there's leaves in the green, and there's flames in the background of the red. Because among gamers specifically, there's an even higher proportion of color blindness than in the general population. You should never use color as the only indication of the distinction between cards. You should have it, for people who can see it, it can be the primary, but for everyone else, there needs to be something else. So you need to think about how you would see this if you were colorblind, how you would see this if it was in grayscale. This is an example of that. The suit shapes are all very different, so the color reinforces the differences, but the primary indication of different suits is the shape of the suit. I wouldn't do black spades, red spades, green spades, all of the same deck. I would have some other indication like the shape of the suit as well to keep the colors separate. Too much color is not always a good thing. If you're using color to do a job, then don't make it try to do more than it can. In the first draft of these cards, I made the different ranks of spies different colors because I thought that looks really cool. And yeah, it does look really cool. It's much less boring than this, but the problem is when you put them in your hand, the point of the different colors is to tell the different card types apart. And when I had all those different colors of spy, I couldn't tell what I had. I had just a bunch of cards in my hand and I had to read each one. They're not distinct by a number in the corner because the layer cards also have a number in the corner. If you fan this hand of cards, you have a little less trouble telling which of them are spies and which of them are something else. So I used color a little too much in this draft and play tested it, like I said before, and found out that it wasn't as good as using it to do the job that it was there for. You probably know this. If you can't read the bottom half, it says this not so much. It's blue text on red background. Don't be tempted to do this, but even more importantly, remember that what you're printing on your printer for your prototypes has an even lower tolerance for this crap than what's going out in the final product. And certainly it isn't going to look the same on the paper as it looks on your screen. This is what happens when you print stuff. If you print stuff on coated paper, you can use less ink and it doesn't gain as much. But when you're printing prototypes, probably on uncoated paper, probably on an inkjet at your house, dot gain is going to make that color flood from the colored areas into the white areas. And it's going to turn what looks like a crisp edge on this type above into this ragged edge that's on the type on the bottom. That brown is made out of 4 colors of ink, and they're all competing to flood into that white space and make the text harder to read. Which means if you're going to do small type, you should probably do dark text on a light background instead of light text on a dark background, because when the dark text bleeds out, it doesn't make it harder to read. When the darkness around white text bleeds into it, it can make it completely disappear. I also just tend to use light backgrounds when I'm printing at home because it uses less ink, just straight up. Like, I'm not trying to make a finished product here, at least not till the very end. RGB is not CMYK, and neither one of them looks anything like this, so this is a difficult screen to look at on this projector, but the screen colors you see cannot all print. The colors you can make by mixing light together do not match the colors you can get by mixing together the 3 colors of ink that come out of your inkjet printer. So there's a lot of really bright greens and purples and blues that will print looking really gray unless you buy extra ink to do exactly that color. So sometimes you'll have unexpected results when you're printing a color thing, and that doesn't illustrate it at all, but I'm just telling you. Let's talk about color and what it means. So here's Andrew again. We're going to take the same type treatment and we're going to color it some different ways. What does that make you think of? Say what?
Family Feud.
Family Feud, I like that. What else? An auto mechanic. I like that too. Good. Yeah. So this is like a Denny's. It's like a McDonald's, a Shell station. This is what modern looked like in 1965. What about this guy?
Jets.
Say what?
The New York Jets.
The New York Jets. Okay. Besides knowing team colors, what else does this look like? It looks kind of like Starbucks to me. This is modern retro. So when someone tries to make something look like it was from 1955, they pick these colors today. There actually is a difference between modern retro and actual retro. I did a box design a while back that was very, very period to the 1920s. And people hated it, and then I did something that was sort of like modern Victoriana, and they were like, oh yeah, that's better. And I'm like, no, it's terrible, but it's what you think it should look like, and so that's what I have to go with. What about that guy?
Nightclub.
Nightclub, all right, what else? Motorcycle race. I took these colors from a D&D ad, actually. Yeah, I cheated a little bit. I did add some art. I put some flames in the letters there because, you know, it can't just be one color. It's got to be flame colored. How about that one?
Maybe a word game.
Maybe a word game. Interesting. What else?
Family
family game. These colors are from My Little Pony. And the light is up in here, so it's kind of hard to see, but these pinks and purples are pretty intense. Again, you're going to look at that and know which game you'd rather play. And I told you nothing about the games. I didn't even change the type. I just changed the color treatment. When you mix those two weapons together, you get something pretty powerful. I'll leave that as an exercise for you, though, because we're going to move on. Talk about art. Art helps us distinguish components in the game. It also tells us what we should be pretending to do when we play the game. This is maybe the reason I'm doing this panel, is because I have this lecture, is because I have so many friends who say art doesn't matter. I have to disagree with each of them, and in this format. Art matters to me as a player. I want to know what I'm pretending to do, and I want to know what each card is pretending to do and how they're different, and tell them apart right away. You can't put this off till the end. You can't wait for a professional graphic designer to throw stuff on this and hope that they do a good job. You really need to put the elements in the game before you get there. So here's a card that has everything I need to know about it. Actually, everything you need to know is right here, the number and the fact that it's a bid card. That's even the name, the title, and the subtitle are extraneous if you're thinking about this game strictly as a mechanism. But this is an entertainment product. Tell me that's not me. That's not me. What are you doing using my alarm noise? All right, so I want to be entertained by this. I want to know what I'm pretending to do. Now, this is from a game called Give Me the Brain, where they're fast food zombies fighting over one brain to try to get their work done. I'm not going to find clip art of that. The story, I Can Hear the Ocean, is a zombie with his fast food uniform with his head stuck in the toilet. I'm not going to find clip art of that until someone steals clip art from my own game, and by then it's too late. But that tells a similar story. The seashell to my ear tells the story of I Can Hear the Ocean in a similar way that the zombie with his head stuck in the toilet, but instead of having to draw it, I found it in about 5 minutes. Actually, I found this in about 10 seconds, but like you have the clip art file already open and running. This piece of art reminds me of the story of the card. It helps me tell jokes about this game while I'm playing it, which is the point of playing this game. Winning isn't the point of games like this. Having fun is the point of games like this. And you're depriving me of the ability to role play when you don't give me all the graphics that help support that. There's the final. Hey, it's a zombie with his head stuck in the toilet. Perfect. Thank you, Brian. Anybody recognize this game? That's Magic the Gathering, folks. That's early playtest cards. Richard, Scaff, and Jim all threw these things together with art on the damn cards. This is the game that I learned how to make games from. And part of what I learned was, I don't want to have to read the text on Juggernaut every time it comes out. Once I know what it does, the picture is enough to remind me what it is. And even when you fan a hand of Magic cards, that little corner, that little sliver of the artwork that you can see in the index reminds you what the card is. When you see that artwork on the other side of the table, you know what the card is without having to pick it up and read it. That's hugely important, and it helps in playtest as much as it helps in the final product. Yeah, absolutely. Good enough. Anything's better than nothing. Cowboys. We're going to talk about clip art here. We're going to talk about using clip art. When you're making a prototype, even a prototype to show to a publisher, you don't need to have your own art. You can steal it. Literally nobody cares. If you want to publish it, then you have to own the art. You have to have rights to it. But if you're just making a prototype, don't sweat it. Go to Google and find the cowboy that's right for you. Every one of these has a different mood. Well, some of them are identical, but every one of these has a different mood that'll suggest what your game is about. Find the cartoony one, find the serious one, find the dark one, find the light one. Like, pick Clint Eastwood, right? That'll communicate to your players what they're supposed to do. It'll even communicate to your publisher what you think the game is about. It'll help inform the art that they eventually choose. So we're going to talk about a very specific example. We all know this card. It's from a game called Poker. It's the Queen of Clubs, and that's what it looks like in the spreadsheet. We're going to turn that into a playable card. The first thing I'm going to do is build it entirely out of letters. I just want to know where my information goes. So this is like laying out that Mos Eisley card before. I just use a Q, a C, and the word art in the middle of the card to tell me how this ought to get laid out. And you could play test your game with this. In fact, in the first rev, you probably should. Don't waste any more time than this. But when you want to play with more casual players who don't want to read QC all the time, let's see how we can make this a little prettier very quickly. The first thing I'm going to do is pick a font that actually sells it. And I said you don't need a lot of fonts, but okay, I'm going to go off of that reservation a little bit, and I'm going to pick a Western font that implies what I think this game is about. I'm going to make kind of a cowboy-themed poker deck. So we're going to find Western font on a free font site. There's one from the front page, Carnival Freak Show. It's got nice numbers, and I actually typed the numbers into the sample text up here so that it would display the characters that I wanted to see. Type the name of your game or the whatever this you're actually going to have in that typeface, and it'll show it to you down here. There's the numerals. Okay, good. There's the numerals and all the letters except the A, because I forgot about the A. And I'm going to stick it up in the corner, and that's my type. I've already given it a little bit better feel than the font that I started with. We need some suit icons. And the game you need probably doesn't need suit icons, but it needs icons of some sort. So you go and search for whatever you're looking for, and look at that ugly thing. Look at that ugly thing. It's horrible. But it's an Illustrator file, and all those pieces are separate pieces. So I can take it apart and throw away everything but that. That's what I need, just that interior club shape. I'm even going to throw away that highlight. It's garbage, right? And certainly the rainbow in the background needs to go away as quickly as possible. So I take that, I pick it apart in Illustrator. It takes no time at all, and I've got clubs. Now, I also do final design on these cards, so I typically draw my own suits at some point. But to do this, that's all I needed to do. What about texture? I want to put this on kind of a worn-out paper. And yeah, of course, my hard drive has thousands of different worn-out papers on, but assume I didn't have that. I go and I look for antique paper. That's one of the pieces I find. It's got an ugly edge that I'm going to throw away. I'm just going to use the middle of it. There's the middle of that paper. I didn't change a bit of it. And I slapped it in the background, and now it looks like an old card. I went to this image for colors alone. I want to make a 4-color deck, and I don't want to bother screwing around in Photoshop till I have the colors I like. Here's a piece of clip art with a palette that I love, so I'm just going to steal the green from that cactus and slap it on my clubs. I'm going to do a 4-color deck here. There's my green. I did make it a little bit darker so it would pop off that background, and it looks terrible in this lighting, but that's what I did there, and now those clubs are green. That piece of clip art was strictly as a color palette. Now I need my image for my queen. I'm going to go find, in this case, a whole set of images that I like. So she belongs in a whole set of cowboys that are roughly the same artist, same style. I don't like how purple she is, though, so 1 second in Photoshop and she's green. I just tinted her with the same color as my clubs. Dropped her in the middle, and now I got a queen of clubs. That whole thing probably took me like 5 minutes, and now I've got a pipeline where the rest of them are going to take me like a minute each. And that work saved me at least that much time in the playtest. The time you spend with your players is expensive and precious. Don't waste it while they try to figure out what they're looking at. We could all play with this, but we're going to play faster and better and enjoy the game with this. So I overdo this because it's fast for me, but I recommend that you all learn how, because it will make your playtest sessions go faster. There's a real life example. I did actually redraw these a little bit, but I grabbed all these models for all these pieces of clip art off the web, picked one font, set of colors, grabbed that plane off the web. Everything here is pretty much just clip art and easy, and that's the game board that we play tested with for most of the lifetime of this game. The final game is different. An artist painted the whole thing, and it's got pretty pictures all over it, but this is a nice functional board thrown together in a few minutes. The hard part, of course, of this board was figuring out where the borders go, but like grabbing the icons for the territories and so on, super quick and well worth doing. All right, let's talk about tools. I don't have any real advice about which tools to use. I'm going to talk about what kinds of tools are out there. I'm going to start with this. Word is not a layout program. Don't pretend it is. It's great for writing your rule books, but when you actually want to print something and have it be the same shape every time, stay away from the W. When I got started in this, I was on a Mac Classic, and it shipped with a thing called GreatWorks, which is no longer available, but it was a great little collection of layout, word processing, spreadsheet, even database tools that I could actually write a spreadsheet and import it into a set of cards automatically. I don't have that kind of functionality anymore, and that thing's long gone. I started using Quark in the 90s. That's a layout program that's still available, believe it or not. I kind of was surprised to find that out. And at the same time learned to use Photoshop. These are things we're probably familiar with. These days, Photoshop, et cetera, are pretty expensive, and they're a subscription program, which old farts like me hate. So there are always good answers out there. If you Google Photoshop killer and Illustrator killer, you're going to find Affinity. You can't see on the screen, but these logos actually have the Photoshop and Illustrator logos like lurking behind them. Like that's how brash they are about saying this is the product that we are replacing. But each one of these things is like $40, which is a little bit better than $40 a month. Still not recommending these, just telling you they're out there. You're going to find 15 different versions of Photoshop killers if you just go look. But Adobe Creative Suite is what I still use. So I'm going to talk about 3 programs that I use from these guys, to do my production work. And they're Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign. There are versions of all of these as cheap as free. And I'm using CS5, which means I did buy it and don't have to pay for it again. And I'm going to keep using it until it doesn't work anymore. Photoshop is for editing photos. You have bitmaps in color, photos that you want to fix the colors on. That's what Photoshop is for. And I do a lot of my layout on this, although it's not very good with type and it's not very good with vectors. It is for making things that look like this, layers of images and not a lot of type. Illustrator is mostly for doing vector-based artwork. So if you're going to draw something that you want scalable, something that you want to be able to use in a lot of different sizes, I do very little in AI. It's my weakest link here. I go over there to make a outline that I can then import into Photoshop and scale wherever I want. InDesign is a layout program. It is for collecting lots of images and text into one place. It is, among all 3 of these, the one that's most familiar with how to print on a page. So your layout program, whether it's Quark or InDesign or PageMaker or whatever else is out there, is your final step. This is how you bring all the ingredients together and spell check it and get it ready for output. And that's true whether it's going to your printer or going to a real printer out there in the real world or China. And that's the end of my lecture, and we have time for questions. Thanks for being patient with me. What can I tell you? Yeah.
Do you feel that there's ever a point that you make a prototype look too good?
Yes, but no. There's no way. It doesn't happen very often. My goal is to make my prototypes look good because I want people to be able to play them. And when I pitch a game, which I rarely do, but when I pitch a game, I want the publisher to know what I expect from the final product. I think the times when my graphic design has been too good, that is to say too finished, are mostly evidenced by bad choices on the publisher's part, where they actually just printed the cards I gave them without realizing that, no, that was meant to be playtest, but they just went ahead and shipped it, sometimes without the right font. So I would blame them mostly. I will say that it's possible to present something that looks too finished in the sense that if you bought a bunch of your own art and you're attached to it, the publisher is going to be in kind of a sticky spot because he doesn't want to use that art. He doesn't have a relationship with that artist and he doesn't like that specific style, but you've invested in a thing that he has to throw away. And that's a pain, right? Which is why I say go to the web, grab clip art, grab art that's clearly clip art, so that you're not giving a wrong impression to a publisher that you've overinvested. Like in tabletop game design, even like bragging about having a patent or a trademark or copyright, it puts the publisher in a weird spot because that's not valuable to him. In other industries it is, in tabletop it really isn't. And certainly, like, he's going to rewrite your rule book whether you wrote it well or not. He's going to redo your art whether your art is good or not. He's going to redo your graphic design. You just want to give him a starting point. If you go too far, it is possible to go too far and then have nobody want to run it back. I would rather just let you keep this than deal with the issues of throwing away the art that you paid for. So that's I think, how you can go too far.
I'll mention, like in the case of games or like digital, there's a thing like the Buxton principle, named after Bill Buxton from Microsoft, where he says the demo, if you're prototyping and showing it to people, it should never be more put together than the state of the code.
Okay.
So if you actually have code behind what you're showing, if you make it look really nice and chromed and it looks like a finished product, then that will confuse people.
I've worked at Microsoft and I understand that perspective.
Oh yeah.
But I don't think that anyone is going to be surprised if your art looks better than your game mechanics. That's just a given, right? But it depends on what you're trying to test. If you're going to show a game to players and you're curious if they will respond to the theme, the art should be as good as possible and the code doesn't matter. So what are you asking your players? What are you asking your testers? I wish someday that I would have a principal named after me, but the Bikeston thing seems like kind of a Microsoft in problem. Like, that's just a problem of having a poor approach to coding.
Well, no, I remember there was a specific comment where the people got hung up on why is this button blue?
Yeah.
And it was like, no, we can change
Right.
all of
Well,
that.
okay, so I can sort of speak to that in a general way.
Yeah.
Throughout the course of testing your game, from the very first, like pitching it to your friends without any components at all, to pitching it to a publisher, every one of those stages, every one of those play tests is a different model for a different question. And so what you're really talking about is a disagreement between the implication of the question and what the actual question is. If I put a bunch of good art in front of testers and say, what do you think of this art, then we're clearly saying, how good is this art? But if I put a bunch of good art in front of testers and say, what do you think of this game? If they interpret the finishedness of the art, the finishedness of the rules, as an implication that it's too late for me to change core mechanics, that's a problem. So I need to communicate clearly to the testers, ignore the art, I stole it from another game, it doesn't matter, this is really early in the process, and feel free to say anything, we can change any of these rules. In tabletop design, it's much easier than it is in computer code to make gigantic changes, even on the fly. But if playtesters feel like they don't have permission to make those changes, that's an uncomfortable spot. You just have to be clear in communicating the purpose of this test. And yeah, the art can probably confuse people about that if you're not clear with them. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I like that you made a functional object out of your sign there.
Yeah, thank you.
As I was looking at that, I had a thought about the logo, that the cheap-ass games logo. There's a lot of contrast between the logo, the typeface and logo itself looks very fancy, to contrast with the name where it sounds like cheap-ass, but it looks like nothing but.
Yeah.
What kind of went to the decision there?
Well, so cheap-ass games is a weird thing that belongs to me now, even though I kind of don't want it. And that is, it's been through 3 phases in its life. Phase 1, we were printing stuff on my laser printer, and it really was cheap, black and white board games in $10 envelopes. And it had a place in a retail store. Unfortunately, nowadays I can't do that, but I'm skipping ahead. Phase 2, I kind of went in hibernation and went and worked in the digital industry and learned a lot about the process of making games and also how I never want to work in that industry again. And then in phase 3, I came back and learned to finance games on Kickstarter, which means that I had the budget to make really, really high-end versions of games that I had done in black and white before. But we kept the name Cheap Ass Games, and it was a hard decision then, and it continues to be difficult. I just had a conversation with one of my marketing people this week. I said, I want to make a tabletop display for Hip Pocket Games, which is an imprint. It's the one we do all of our sort of small card games under. And he said, well, nobody knows that name. It needs to say Cheap Ass on it. And I'm like, yes. The point of making the display is to get people to know that name, but this is the brand that people know. So yeah, it is ironically expensive looking for a company name that used to make sense. We can't print black and white stuff anymore at any significant discount to the full color stuff. The price of printing is now shipping and materials. It's not pre-press. It's not ink. And it's weird that I couldn't make those black and white games today even if I wanted to, but my laser printer certainly doesn't want to handle it. And the small printers that I used to use that could do volumes of 200 and 1,000 games, they're all gone. They've all been sucked up by bigger printers because nobody needs printed anything anymore. Nobody needs business cards and flyers at the rate that they used to 20, 30 years ago. So yeah, it's a weird place to be in. And every time we try to create an imprint that steps away from the cheap-ass name, we keep falling back into the black hole of the brand that people know better. Yeah.
Do you think it's worthwhile to print on demand prototypes, or should people just do it on their own?
It depends on what you're testing, again. And I do print on demand prototypes all the time. The problem is it takes 2 weeks or longer to get one. But the benefit is that you have durable components, and I'm working on a card game right now where the backs are kind of important, and sleeving cards gives me the card sleeve backs and not a real card back. So when I get to that stage and I have the patience to order that prototype, I absolutely do it. If you're going to be pitching to a publisher and you want a well-printed prototype with good components, nothing wrong with doing that. It's entirely a function of, well, the price, which is negotiable, but also the time delay. When I'm working on a board game, I want a thing I can test right now, and I don't always have the patience to wait 2 or 3 weeks to get a new copy of it.
I have a question on UI. So switching from text to symbols.
Yeah.
So I have a game that the prototype version, the version I'm going to be pitching with actually, all I have is text.
Yeah.
Because I'm not going to come up with an original symbol, like, let's say Race for the Galaxy.
Mhm.
Million symbols, you play the game, you know what it means. If you haven't played the game, you're going to be lost.
Who knows why there's so much symbology in mass-produced games? Specifically games coming out of Europe. Localization.
Translation.
Yes, localization. The thing is, if I print cards or board components or an expensive component of the game, it's more expensive and risky for me to print a lot of different language versions of that. If I print a bunch of French and only the Germans like it, then I have a bunch of French stuff I can't sell. But if I convert everything into a symbolic form, then those components can be language neutral, and I can put them in any box. And I can have the rule book, which is cheap to print, suffer the indignities of being in multiple languages, right? One of my publishers, I did a game about ancient Rome. He took cards that were in English and converted them into this symbolic language, and about 50% of them converted fine. About a quarter of them were kind of weird, and about a quarter of them just got cut because there was no way to do it. And that was frustrating, but he also changed the card names into Latin, so he didn't have to localize it because nobody speaks Latin. Ship it. I personally didn't like that experience, and I personally don't like symbolic logic on cards unless it's clearly superior to English. But the reason I think that you're used to seeing it in a lot of board games is that localization issue. You don't need to create a new language, and you don't need to teach somebody a new language to play your game. So I would steer away from it unless it's really clear. Now, there's some things like the hearts, you know, or a mana symbol, or things that are really easy to communicate. Those things make sense, but like a procedure that used to take 3 lines of text, reducing that to 2 symbols and a red arrow, like, doesn't always work. I would steer clear of it, even if you're going to sell it to a publisher. Say, look, if you really want to localize this, that's on you. It's your problem. Here's how we tried it. Here's how well it worked, but I don't recommend it. Like, I would go with that tack.
We got a question on Facebook from Sarah. She asked, have you ever pitched or know someone who has successfully pitched a reskin of an existing game?
Yeah, all the time.
Can
Yeah.
you elaborate on?
There are very familiar game mechanics in the hobby game industry. There are games that are successful with very small changes, if any, to existing games. But I don't want to name names because people already think I'm really mean. But it's not at all unusual to see a game that is really familiar to a game that you've seen before. Often, in some cases, pitched by the same inventor. Inventors sort of seem to have a style sometimes where if it worked once, it's going to work again with a different theme. And there's also, there are very successful genre-defining games that are immediately copied. And for instance, when Magic the Gathering came out, there were a lot of trading card games right away that didn't really learn much new. They just sort of said, well, Magic is selling in random boosters, and so I'll take a similar mechanic and sell random boosters. It was frustrating then. That's kind of when I was learning the business, and it continues to be frustrating now. But yeah, it's all over the place.
So I probably have this problem at a bit of a different scale than you do because I make tabletop RPGs. But do you have any insight on a good pipeline from getting text into InDesign?
From what?
From whatever text editing program is more useful.
No, I don't. I would say for any questions that you have on things like that, refer to the web because YouTube is full of good examples. But I don't typically do a lot of long format stuff. I don't do a lot of books. So my pipeline from Word to InDesign is copy-paste. I only have to do it once. As far as trying to get something that's multiple chapters and multiple page breaks and so on into InDesign, my attack would be copying, pasting section at a time. So no, nothing better than that comes to mind. But if you're in an environment working with lots of creators and you're working in like a Google Doc and you want to be able to import that quickly, there's ways. I just don't know. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for someone wanting to get involved in the graphic design side of tabletop games? Like, would you approach big publishers first or freelance or?
All of that. I mean, the general advice for getting into hobby is getting a job, doing whatever. My first hobby game work was compiling a digest of MTGL for Wizards of the Coast. That was back when everyone was communicating in words. I took the noise that was on the Magic the Gathering mailing list and cut it down to 10% of signal. But yeah, I mean, these companies do need graphic designers. They typically use freelancers for that work. Your hardest challenge might be to convince them that they need somebody, but show them a resume and absolutely get your foot in the door. Yeah, that's a great way to start. I mean, yeah, that's a career, really. I did graphics and layout and technical writing all before I did game design, so that's how far back my background goes. And I wound up self-publishing, which means I do all of the jobs at my place, but certainly most people don't do it that way. Just a couple minutes left. Any other further questions about anything at all? I could tell you more about that. I guess I should have gone to that one before. Crab Fragment is my new imprint. It's going to replace Cheap Ass Games. No, not really. Not really. No, but look out. I put that logo on a T-shirt. I love to hate it.
Have you heard of the 7-line rule for cards?
7 lines.
Yeah. So this is just a conversation. This isn't a question.
I want 7 perpendicular lines.
Yeah. No. Of course. No.
They're all red, but I want you to draw 4 of them with green ink. Who knows that video, by the way?
Yes.
Like, I've lived that meeting so many times. Okay, go ahead.
So basically the rule is you shouldn't have more than 7 lines of text because players will not read beyond the 7th line. It should matter on how wide it is, but it's...
You know how many lines of text I like on a card? 1 number. Like, that number is completely arbitrary, and I think it sounds like it comes out of Wizards of the Coast, right? The 7-line rule seems like the sort of thing that they use to pat themselves on the back when they manage to fit some encyclopedia of rules into 7 lines. But I don't think that there's a magic number. I think there's a different player group for each number. I think there's play groups that won't sustain more than 1 line of text. Mm-hmm. So it's really, what is your game about, and who are your players, and what will they tolerate?
Do you have any thoughts on legibility as far as font sizes for different areas of the card?
Print it and test it. I'm getting old, and it's hard for me to read things upside down across the table, so I'm pretty lazy about making stuff big. That's why I like the art, because if I can identify the art, I don't have to read the card again. Steve Jackson is the worst culprit for this, who always wants things bigger because he's been blind as a mole since 30 years ago. But again, that's every one of these questions is not an answer, but a question that you should take to your playtest and put it in front of people and say, are you tolerating this? When you're testing and running a game, you've got to watch your players carefully. You've got to have your own questions that you sometimes can't even ask them because they won't give you honest answers. But you've got to watch how they interact with your design, be it graphic design or the mechanics of the game or the story of the game, any of that. The way they interact with it is really valuable, especially if, in some cases, they don't know that's what you're looking for. And yes, afterwards you can say, okay, did you have any trouble reading the cards? But during the test, you need to observe and see if they have any trouble reading the cards. As to legible point sizes, I think probably the smallest one that your word processor or layout program offers you is the smallest you want to go. But practically speaking, there are probably reference points to, on the web for what point sizes. I don't think I ever go below, it pains me to go below 9. But that is going to depend on the type as well. I'm doing a series of games in a magazine. There are full-page ads that are variant games for pairs. And just yesterday, I had to reduce the point size on one of them because I've been running it at 11 point for the last 7 months. And this one had just slightly more rules, like 40% more rules. I'm still cramming it onto the same page, so I kill most of the graphics and I shrink it down to 10.5 point type, and that's as small as I want to go. but all those rules are so good.
When it comes to doing a fairly early playtest, what's your view on explaining mechanics versus shorthanding them onto cards?
Well, if it's fairly early playtest, you might sometimes just have to explain it. Like, you're not really testing your rule book at that point. You're like, would this be fun if we did it? And so, like, testing the expression of the rules, testing how the rule is phrased on the cards, that's a little bit later in the process than seeing if people can do it once they know what they're supposed to do. So in an early playtest, you'll even tell people, look, the strategy is this. Open your hands, talk about what you're doing. Like, I want to get good at this game as soon as I can and find out if it's really good, and then throw it away if I have to and make the next one. But when it starts to settle, then you get into the phases where, okay, read the card and tell me what it does, and tell me what you think it does, and watch people, get it wrong. You can't learn much more than when you watch people get stuff wrong. People are dumb. People bring really weird expectations into the game, and I think even when you do early playtests, if you say this game's about being a chef and cooking and gathering ingredients, like they're going to bring expectations you had no idea. Like, why is there no cat in this game? I don't know. Why is there no cat? Who said anything about a cat? Right? That's the beauty of early playtesting. That you get the bounce ideas out of people with totally different mindsets than you, and then a cat becomes a part of the game. It's pretty cool. Well, that's the end of the time. Thank you all very much. I know you want to move around before the next lecture, and so do I. So thanks, and go make better looking games.